I'm sure many of you have seen the ads on TikTok for the new documentary called Quiet on Set. This documentary outlines all of the terrible abuse that has happened at Nickelodeon for the past 30 years. I went into watching this thinking, well, I already have some pretty strong suspicions about all of the terrible stuff that's going on behind the scenes there, so maybe this is just kind of tell me something that I already knew. I mean, I'd already seen the headlines from 2018 of Dan Schneider, the big Nickelodeon hitmaker, being asked to step down at Nickelodeon because they found out after the investigation about all the terrible child abuse and what he was doing to the staff he was hiring, specifically the women there. But I watched this and I had so many emotions rise to the surface that I almost couldn't even finish it. But I'm very happy that I did finish it. And I would highly recommend anybody to watch it, even if you didn't grow up with Nickelodeon in the late 90s or early 2000s. I learned the truth about some really, really terrible injustices that happened behind closed doors at Nickelodeon headquarters and had this terrible domino effect on real people. The purpose of this video is not to rehash anything that was said in that film necessarily, so if you haven't seen it, I recommend you go watch the series first before watching this video. Today, I'm only here to get my thoughts on it. Abuse, very sadly, presents itself in many different forms: emotional, verbal, physical. Some of these child actors and actresses were forced to work beyond their legally bounded set times, sometimes working 14-hour plus long days and having their job security threatened if they didn't comply. I think that a lot of people are kind of quick to write this off with some sort of like, well, hey, they're living the high life on this major network and they're getting paid to do so. So working overtime for them is probably a treat. But what's revealed throughout the film is that a lot of these kids came from pretty impoverished backgrounds. And for them, this was one, a huge opportunity for them to bring their family into more stable living conditions. And two, it was a huge risk for them to incur. I've only recently learned from somebody I know who's a child actor that it can actually be very expensive to accept a major role in film or TV. Your family often has to relocate to a new expensive city where the set is, but sometimes you're not compensated for your living expenses depending on if it's a TV series or if it's a movie, and even still, sometimes you won't get paid until after set is wrapped, or at least it'll be delayed payments until new episodes come out. So not only are some of these kids working overtime at 9, 10, 11 years old and not being compensated, but if they complain or their parents complain, they could just be fired and they could be blacklisted from working on any sort of program that's associated with the network. This may not constitute physical abuse in its traditional definition, but there's something so sinister about the emotional component of not having a safe work environment to vocalize when something is wrong. The bar just gets raised and raised for these kids. And before you know it, working every single hour of the day in hopes that you'll be recognized and given some special opportunity is just the norm. If you get on Dan Schneider's bad side, you're not getting off of his bad side. He will make sure that these kids don't go anywhere after set is wrapped. The hired staff writers, who were women, were forced to split half of a salary to the men, and they would receive threatening private phone calls saying that they would be fired and, you guessed it, blacklisted if they ever raised a complaint about it. I know what it's like to be the less favored member of a group and not receive the phone call about where we're supposed to meet for a job site the next day because I decided to leave work at 1 a.m. the day before instead of 3 a.m. the day before. I've been excluded from very important meetings before that were supposed to happen and then ridiculed for not being up to date on the newest projects or deadlines. And I absolutely resonate with the anxiety of feeling like I have to comply, because this is an opportunity, and if I don't just shut up and deal with it, then it might pass me by. Even when work hours were normal, though, I've been in situations where it was completely hostile to raise any sort of concerns about the work environment. I've had heavy pieces of gear thrown at my head if I had packed something out of order. I've been told that it was unacceptable to take 3 days off for a trip that was scheduled almost 2 years in advance, and then was given the silent treatment for 3 days afterwards because of it. So part of me can empathize with these kids that feel like there's no place for them to say that things aren't right. I would now like to make a comment based on personal experiences about the nuances between men suffering in silence and women suffering in silence as it relates to the series. Unfortunately, both men and women are not always believed when they bring forth evidence about abuse, whether it's emotional, verbal, sexual. It is often the case that men are told to shrug off any sort of emotional abuse. You're a man, you should just toughen up. And women are sometimes disregarded when they report on any sort of sexual abuse. A slap on the wrist, that'll put the perpetrator in their place, so there's no need for any further action. And to me, it's a lot more sad to see this happen to children because they're less equipped to handle these situations than adults. I mean, I was an adult, or at least I was of the age to be considered an adult, 18, and it took me 5 years to finally put an end to an abusive situation that I was entangled in. And these kids can't even turn to their parents, because a lot of them were kept at arm's length by all the Nickelodeon producers. And two, because if they actually did see something and say something, they'd just be fired. The years that it took to get these terrible child predators behind bars because they were so carefully protected is a travesty. I mean, it's a terrible feeling as an adult to know that there's nobody who's going to protect you from an abuser. I would be terrified if I was a child. I remember having so many conversations with people who saw me get berated, who saw me have doors slammed in my face, who saw me get my personal baggage aired out to thousands of people, who saw me get told daily how unimportant and replaceable I was, and they did nothing to stop the abuser. I mean, it was like one of the most lonely times of my entire life. Similar to how Dan Schneider was kept around because 1, he did really good work, and 2, because he had seniority. I've seen with my own 2 eyes very hurtful and abusive people be protected for very frivolous and unsubstantial reasons. Reasons that to us nowadays probably seem very obvious, but when the perfect storm happens, these people are unstoppable. I also think that there's a reasonable argument to be made that these things happen a little more frequently in industries that are a little looser with the regulations. I'd say that entertainment and the arts are a little bit more unmonitored industries. And that is not to say that these kinds of things don't happen in other industries. I mean, maybe it's worse in other industries, because who would ever suspect that at a dentist's office this kind of behavior would fly? But secretly, thousands of dentists are just suffering in silence. I would like to think that some people who protect abusers are just afraid and don't know how to say it. Most of the women who worked at Nickelodeon in this era were horrifically sexualized, and they would kind of pretend that nothing was happening because they were scared and they didn't want to rock the boat. Those who did say something were immediately fired and blacklisted. I've had opportunities taken away from me because I was the only person who was willing to say that something was wrong and people didn't like that. I've had people promise to fulfill their obligations to getting somebody fired who's extremely abusive and then change their mind the next day. I am so sad to think that I worked in an environment for a very long time where women were so viciously harassed and they were too scared to have the abuser removed. I regularly tried to work towards an environment that was free of the unasked for physical contact, grotesque sexual comments, and sometimes subtle advances, but I was told that things are just best the way that they are. And I had to respect the wishes of these women, obviously, but I would be lying if I said it didn't make me really sad to see this behavior persist. And of course, we could not talk about this film without mentioning the men that suffered in silence at the hand of sexual abuse. I thankfully don't have any personal experience with this, but oh my gosh, I don't even know what to say. I mean, these poor boys who are now men that were so terribly assaulted. I can only hope and pray that this cycle ends, and my heart goes out to these men who are courageous enough to speak up about what these terrible, terrible producers and staff writers and dialogue coaches were doing to them. I can only imagine how difficult it was to speak up about that. One of the feelings that came up for me more than anything throughout watching this series is this uneasy feeling that justice is never fully served. These predators got tons of letters of support from big Hollywood stars, they barely served any time, and then they were immediately hired by another big network right after that. Dan Schneider got a $7 million severance check from Nickelodeon. The man who had Ariana Grande reenact graphic style scenes for millions of perverts to just watch in the luxury of their own homes on their television got a $7 million severance pay. Think about the amount of time that passed between the abuse and this documentary coming out. I mean, lots of us, myself included, might not have ever known the names of some of these victims. History would have been written in a way that is far less truthful and revealing. There's a feeling of guilt that's associated with speaking up against somebody who is themselves obviously tortured or hurt. I think many victims feel like they're punching down when they speak up about something that happened to them. 1, because it might affect their reputation, but 2, because it might affect the person who's hurting them, which I know sounds ridiculous, but there is a weird psychological fog that surrounds somebody who's being victimized. It can feel like you're attacking somebody who themselves is damaged and can't control any of their behavior. It can feel like you're crazy. It can feel like you're the only one who sees it because you're the only one who's actually willing to say something. If you're a man, it can feel emasculating to say that another man is treating you in a way that is giving you night terrors or sending you to therapy. I'm sure as a woman, it can feel incredibly uncomfortable and vulnerable to have to recall any sort of abuse, only for people to tell you that you're probably lying or that somebody will just replace you. And there will still be some people that are going to go to the grave not knowing that they're associating with abusers. And frankly, I could be associating with abusers and not know it. But I will proudly never be remembered as somebody who is complicit or compliant in the presence of an abuser. I will never be remembered as somebody who was a bystander and didn't speak up for those who needed a voice. I will never be remembered as the person who said that they were going to help liberate you from being scared to work every single day and then did nothing. I will never be remembered as the person who stripped away opportunities from somebody else because they had the courage to say that something was wrong. And I will never be an abuser. And if you protect one, then shame on you.